Have you ever stopped to wonder how a room full of incredibly smart people can come together and make a decision that is just spectacularly wrong? Well, today we're diving into groupthink. It's this hidden psychological force that explains exactly that. How the human desire to fit in can completely hijack our ability to think clearly. So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the feeling I think we've all had, that pressure to just go along with the crowd. From there, we'll actually define what groupthink is and look at the recipe for a bad decision. Then we'll get into some real-world fiascos and, more importantly, how to fight back against this hive mind. And finally, we'll turn the spotlight on ourselves and our own blind spots. All right, let's jump right in. Before we get into all the theory, I want to start with a feeling, a really human, really common experience that I am almost certain is going to sound familiar to you. Come on, we've all been there, right? You're sitting around a table, a plan is unfolding, and you spot a massive flaw, a big problem. But then you look around the room. Everyone's nodding, the boss is smiling, and you just say nothing. Why? Why do we do that? Well, that instinct to stay quiet is powered by two really strong social forces. On one hand, you've got normative influence. This is our fundamental need to be liked. It's pure social survival. We're afraid of being the outcast, the one who messes up the good vibe. On the other hand, you have informational influence. This is when we start to doubt ourselves. We think, hey, maybe they all know something I don't. One is about fear of rejection, the other is about self-doubt, but they both lead to the exact same place: silence. Okay, so let's zoom out from that one person biting their tongue in a meeting. What happens when that pressure to conform infects the entire decision-making process of a group? Well, that's when you get groupthink. So here's the official definition. At its core, groupthink is when the need for agreement completely crushes any realistic look at the alternatives. The team's unity becomes the goal, not making the right call. So instead of solving conflict and debating ideas, the group just starts pretending that problems don't even exist. The man who put a name to this phenomenon was a Yale psychologist, Irving Janis, and this quote from him is absolutely brilliant. He had this incredible insight that the very things we think make a team great, friendliness, team spirit, cohesion, can actually be its fatal flaw. That amiability can become a weapon that silently kills off all the critical thinking a group needs to succeed. So, how does a smart, friendly team end up in this trap? It doesn't just happen out of nowhere. Janis found there's a specific set of conditions, almost like a recipe for disaster, that create the perfect storm for groupthink. There are three main ingredients. First, you need that high group cohesiveness, a really tight-knit team. Second, you add in some structural faults. This is stuff like being cut off from outside opinions, having a leader who makes their preference known from the start, or just not having any clear rules for how to debate. And for the final ingredient, you sprinkle in a stressful situational context. When a group is under extreme pressure, it's way more likely to cling to a simple, comforting answer than get into a messy, difficult debate. Now, when these conditions are all met, a very clear set of symptoms starts to pop up. Janis broke them down into three types. The first type is all about the group developing this really inflated, dangerous sense of its own awesomeness. This shows up in two ways. First, there's the illusion of invulnerability. The group starts to feel like they literally can't lose, which encourages them to take wild risks. And second, you get this unquestioned belief in the group's morality. They start thinking, we're the good guys, so whatever we decide must be the right thing to do, which lets them completely ignore any ethical red flags. The next set of symptoms is what Janis called closed-mindedness. Once the group believes it's untouchable and morally perfect, it starts to build a fortress to keep out any information that might challenge that belief. And this plays out in two ways. The group gets amazing at rationalizing away any warnings. Instead of looking at a red flag and getting worried, they come up with a clever reason why it doesn't matter. And they start creating these crude stereotypes of their opponents. Anyone who disagrees with them isn't just wrong, they're weak or biased or just plain stupid. It makes it really easy to dismiss their arguments without ever having to think about them. And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most insidious type of symptom. This intense, overwhelming pressure for everyone to be on the same page. The group's focus turns inward, and its mission becomes to crush any and all dissent. This is where independent thought really goes to die. People start practicing self-censorship. They have doubts, but they keep them to themselves. This leads to an illusion of unanimity, where the leader looks around the room and thinks everyone agrees just because nobody's talking. If someone brave does speak up, they face direct pressure from the group, often being accused of being disloyal. And then you get this really weird phenomenon, the rise of mind guards. These are people who take it upon themselves to protect the group from any inconvenient facts or dissenting opinions. They're like the gatekeepers of the bad idea.
Now, this isn't just some dusty academic theory. The fingerprints of groupthink are all over some of history's biggest disasters. In fact, Janus developed his entire theory by studying these exact kinds of failures. Just look at this quote leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. It is a perfect textbook example. You see that illusion of invulnerability. The United States would surely win. And that stereotyping of the opponent, the idea that the Japanese would never dare. U.S. military leaders rationalized away all kinds of intelligence, and that collective overconfidence led to a truly catastrophic failure to prepare. And then there's the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was really Janus's main case study. You had President Kennedy and his team, literally nicknamed the best and the brightest, and they just swallowed a completely flawed CIA plan whole. People in the room, like the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., later admitted that they completely censored their own doubts because they didn't want to break the confident mood. It was a total humiliation driven by groupthink. But maybe the most tragic and clear-cut example is the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. The night before the launch, engineers were frantically waving red flags, warning that the cold weather could cause the O-rings on the rocket boosters to fail catastrophically. But NASA managers were under enormous pressure to launch. In a now infamous meeting, they did something stunning. They flipped the burden of proof. Instead of making the engineers prove it was safe to launch, they told them they had to prove it was unsafe, an impossible task on such short notice. The pressure to stick to the schedule forced them to rationalize away the data, and 73 seconds after launch, that decision led to an absolute tragedy. Now, here's the good news. Groupthink is powerful, but it's not inevitable. After the Bay of Pigs, President Kennedy was horrified, and he completely changed how his team made decisions. And it worked. A year later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they avoided disaster. This proves you can fight back. There's a whole toolkit of strategies we can use. Here are some of the most effective tactics. For starters, leaders need to keep their opinions to themselves at the beginning. You have to make every single person in the room feel like it's their job to be a critical evaluator. It's also a great idea to bring in outside experts whose whole job is to poke holes in your plan. You can even split your team into smaller groups to see if they come up with different answers. But there's one technique that is probably the most powerful of them all. And that is formally appointing a devil's advocate. This is a game changer because it makes disagreement a structural part of the process. Suddenly, questioning the plan isn't an act of disloyalty. It's your assigned job. The person in this role is given a free pass. In fact, they're required to challenge every assumption and force the group to really defend its logic. It's a simple change, but it can completely shatter that illusion of unanimity. So these tools are great, and they really do work, but we have to be honest about what we're up against. We fall into groupthink so easily because it taps into a really deep, fundamental part of what it means to be human. And that's explained by what psychologists call social identity theory. The idea is simple. A huge chunk of our self-esteem comes from the groups we belong to, our company, our team, our family. We're wired to divide the world into us and them. And because our own self-worth is tied up in our group success, we will defend it fiercely. So when someone from inside our group speaks up and disagrees, it doesn't just feel like a difference of opinion. On some deep primal level, it feels like an attack on the group itself, which means it feels like an attack on us. And that really brings us to the final and most important point. Now that you know all of this, the causes, the symptoms, the deep psychology, the real challenge isn't just to see groupthink in history books, it's to see it in your own life. So think about it. Your team at work, your community project, even your group of friends. Where is the harmony just a little too perfect? Where is the silence a little too loud? Which of your groups really truly needs a devil's advocate?